I remember the moment like a tiny movie scene, fluorescent light, the low hum of a fan, my thumb hovering over send. It was a message that would reroute my life. At least that's what I told myself. One click, and I'd become the brave person who finally chose the future instead of inheriting it. I pressed it. My chest loosened. I felt authored. Then the questions arrived. Why that day, not last month? Why that job, not the other? Why did the right decision suddenly feel obvious only after 3 sleepless nights, 2 unexpected bills, and 1 conversation that hit a nerve? When I rewound the tape, my choice looked less like a steering wheel and more like a dashboard light and indicator of forces already in motion. That's the uncomfortable doorway of this video, the possibility that what we call choice is often the last step in a chain we didn't notice. And if that's true, the future isn't something we pick from a menu, it's something we drift into unless we learn what's pulling us, not fate in a mystical sense, more like physics, psychology, and social gravity, arranging the room before we walk in and call it ours. When we say I chose, we imagine a clean fork, 2 paths, 1 decider, 1 decisive moment, like the universe paused politely while we weighed pros and cons. But real choice is messier. It's a fog of tiny nudges, the default option that was already selected, the friend who texted at the perfect time, the fear you didn't admit, the identity you've been rehearsing for years. Psychology has a blunt word for this: framing. Change the frame and people choose differently, even when the underlying facts stay the same. And you don't need a lab to see it. Put a snack at eye level and watch your future rewrite itself. Rename a risk as an opportunity and notice how your body relaxes. Choice is not just about what you want, it's about what shows up as wantable. Here's the trick. The fork in the road is often built earlier by habits, environments, and expectations, so that when you arrive, one path feels like you and the other feels like betrayal. The sensation of freedom might be real, but it may be arriving late after the stage has been dressed. And once you notice the stage, you start asking who designed it first. To understand why choice feels personal while behaving mechanical, I like to start with a simple image, a marble on a landscape. The marble can go many places, sure, but only along slopes that exist. The shape of the terrain decides what's easy, what's hard, and what never happens at all. Physics calls those shapes constraints. Your life has constraints too: time, money, skills, social permission, even attention. And underneath all of that, the universe runs on rules that do not negotiate. Energy must balance. Causes precede effects. Systems follow dynamics. You can't decide to violate conservation laws the way you decide to change your haircut. So whatever choosing is, it's happening inside a box. Here's the uncomfortable part. Once you accept that, you start seeing decisions as outcomes of prior states, not miracles appearing from nowhere. Your mood is a state. Your stress level is a state. Your relationships are states. When states change, your preferences change. What you call a new direction can be a new equilibrium. I'm not saying you're a robot. I'm saying your freedom, whatever it is, has borders. And borders have consequences. In the next section, we'll test that idea with a coin that chooses. Picture a coin flip, the classic symbol of freedom. Heads or tails, no destiny, pure chance. Now tighten the scene. Imagine the coin inside a controlled chamber. High-speed cameras. Sensors measuring angle, force, air density, surface friction. In that world, the flip stops being a gamble. It becomes a trajectory. The coin doesn't decide. It obeys. If you knew the initial conditions with precision, you could predict the landing. The only reason it feels random is because you and I don't have access to that precision. We call the gap chance, but it's missing information. This matters because a lot of what we label freedom is the same gap. We don't know the full set of inputs shaping our next move. The hormone pulse, the prior memory, the social threat, the reward prediction error bubbling under language. So when we act, we experience it as open, as if we could have done otherwise in the same state. But the coin teaches a lesson. If you replay the same state, you replay the same outcome. The future feels selectable because we can't see the hidden variables. Hold that thought because now we turn the camera from the coin to the brain directly. Once you've seen how random can be deterministic with enough information, You start noticing a new fear. What if the same is true of you? The kind that shows up as patterns you swear you'll break, and then don't. Think about the last time you changed your mind. Was it a pure act of will, or did something shift in the inputs? A new piece of information, a new emotion, a new social signal. The brain is not a courtroom with a judge. It's a weather system. Pressures move, fronts collide. And what you call "I decided" may be the moment the storm becomes visible, not the moment it begins. Here's the first crack in the mythology. We don't just choose actions. We inherit biases, defaults, cravings, and fears. We adopt identities that come with scripts. Then we confuse the script for the author. If that sounds bleak, that discomfort is the signal that we're touching the mechanism. Because once you see the mechanism, you can stop arguing with yourself and start altering the conditions. But before we talk about altering anything, we need one question. If the universe runs lawfully moment to moment, what is a choice made of? In the early days of classical physics, there was a dangerous idea. Imagine an intelligence vast enough to know the exact position and velocity of every particle in the universe, not vaguely, precisely. With that information, the future would not be guessed, it would be calculated. The past, reconstructed, the entire timeline, unfolded like a solved equation. This thought experiment became known as Laplace's demon, and while no such being exists, the logic behind it is the part that lingers. If every state evolves from prior states according to lawful dynamics, then what happens next is not spontaneous. It is the consequence of what already is. Now pause. That doesn't mean you can predict everything. It means events don't emerge from nowhere. They emerge from conditions. When you chose your last major life direction, those conditions were already in place. Your skills, your fears, your financial pressure, your confidence, your relationships. The demon doesn't need magic, it needs data. And if the universe unfolds lawfully, then the real question isn't whether you choose the future, it's whether you understand the forces already shaping it. But then physics itself seemed to rebel. Just when determinism looked airtight, quantum mechanics cracked the surface. At microscopic scales, particles behave probabilistically. You cannot know both position and momentum with perfect precision. Outcomes exist as distributions, not certainties. For many, this felt like oxygen. If the universe isn't fully predictable, maybe free will slips through that gap. But here's the subtle mistake. Randomness does not equal authorship. If your decision were the result of quantum noise, that wouldn't make it more you. It would make it less coherent. A dice roll is unpredictable, but it isn't meaningful. It doesn't express intention. Indeterminacy removes perfect foresight. It does not automatically insert conscious control. The temptation is to treat uncertainty as freedom. But uncertainty may simply mean we can't calculate precisely. The system still evolves. It just does so within probabilities instead of single trajectories. So whether deterministic or probabilistic, physics still describes transitions from state to state. And that brings us to a moment where intuition collapses completely. Because the most uncomfortable evidence doesn't come from particles. It comes from your own brain. Here's where the air changes. In controlled laboratory experiments, researchers measured brain activity while participants made simple decisions, like pressing a button with the left or right hand. The participants reported the moment they consciously decided, but the instruments told a different story. Neural activity predicting the action appeared before the participant reported awareness of choosing, not after. Before. Milliseconds may sound small, but in neural terms, it's enormous. It suggests the brain begins preparing an action prior to the conscious narrative that claims ownership. The conscious experience of deciding might be more like a news anchor reporting on events already unfolding backstage. This doesn't mean you're a puppet. It means awareness might not be the initiator you assume it is. The proof moment isn't mystical, it's measurable. Brain states shift, action potentials rise, then awareness says, I decided. If that sequence holds, then what we call choice may be the surface ripple of deeper physical processes. And if that's true, we have to zoom out again, because physics doesn't just shape neurons. It shapes everything that makes certain actions easier than others. One of the most powerful ideas in physics is simple. Systems move towards states of lower energy cost. Entropy increases. Structures settle. Gradients flatten. Now translate that into daily life. Habits form because they reduce effort. Repeated behaviors strengthen neural pathways, lowering the energy required to execute them. Over time, the easiest action becomes the default action. Not because you consciously endorsed it, but because it cost less. Scroll instead of read. React instead of reflect. React instead of reflect. Repeat instead of reinvent. The future doesn't just happen randomly. It often follows the path requiring the least friction. When you say, "That's just who I am," it may be more accurate to say, "That's the groove I've worn deepest." And grooves matter. They channel motion. The marble rolls where the slope allows. The brain fires where the circuit is strongest. The system flows where resistance is minimal. So now the question sharpens. If physics pushes systems toward efficiency and stability, and your brain obeys physical law, then what exactly are you inside that system? Because the answer changes everything. Strip away the poetry and you are astonishingly physical. Electrochemical gradients, ion exchanges, hormone fluctuations, blood glucose levels adjusting your patience, sleep deprivation, altering your risk tolerance. These aren't metaphors. They are measurable variables influencing your perception and judgment in real time. On days you're exhausted, you choose safety. On days you feel energized, you choose risk. Change the biology and you change the preference landscape. You are not separate from physics. You are an organized expression of it. This doesn't erase meaning. It reframes it. If your decisions emerge from interacting physical states, then your future is shaped by the configuration of those states. Change the configuration and trajectories shift. Leave them untouched and patterns repeat. The uncomfortable realization is this. The future you think you are selecting may already be statistically favored by your current structure. And that structure includes something even more intricate than atoms. It includes a brain that might be deciding before you ever feel it. In the next chapter, we descend into that circuitry. Imagine sitting in a lab staring at a blank screen, told to press a button whenever you feel like it. No pressure, no consequence, just choose. Electrodes measure your brain activity while a clock tracks the exact moment you report the conscious urge to act. You wait, you feel the intention form, you press. But the data shows something unsettling. A measurable buildup of neural activity begins before you report the conscious decision. The brain ramps up toward action first. Awareness arrives second. It's called a readiness signal, a gradual rise in electrical activity preceding voluntary movement. The implication is subtle but seismic. The machinery initiates preparation and the story of "I decided" follows. It feels backward. We assume consciousness lights the fuse, yet the fuse may already be burning before we notice the spark. This doesn't prove we lack agency. It proves the timeline is not what intuition suggests. If awareness is not the starting pistol, what is its role? Is it steering, or is it narrating? Because once the order flips, the entire mythology of inner command begins to wobble, and wobble invites deeper questions. Some argue that even if the brain prepares action early, consciousness still holds veto power. The mind can cancel, override, step in at the last second. That sounds reassuring until you look closer. If the readiness signal builds unconsciously, what generates the veto? Another signal, another buildup, another cascade of neural events that precedes awareness. You may feel like you stopped yourself, but the stopping itself had a neural prelude. It's like trying to find the first domino in a chain reaction, only to realize each domino was pushed by another before it. The sense of a central commander dissolves into distributed processing, circuits evaluating reward, circuits evaluating risk, circuits evaluating risk, circuits integrating memory and prediction. Decision is the resolution of competing activity patterns. Consciousness may not be the CEO. It may be the meeting minutes. That doesn't make it useless. It makes it interpretive. And interpretation has power, but not the kind we were taught. Because if the brain is assembling action beneath awareness, then the self we experience might be more historian than architect. Which brings us to narrative. After you act, your brain does something extraordinary. It explains. You send the email. You decline the offer. You take the risk. Then almost instantly, a reason forms. It feels authentic. It feels coherent. It feels like the cause. But psychological research shows humans are remarkably good at generating plausible explanations, even when unaware of the true drivers of behavior. The brain values coherence. It stitches events into a story that protects identity. The narrative self isn't necessarily lying. It's compressing complexity. Thousands of neural variables collapse into a sentence. I wanted to. That sentence feels like origin, but it may be summary. Think of consciousness as a press conference. The machinery runs backstage, decisions resolve through interacting circuits. Then the spokesperson steps forward and delivers meaning. The story becomes the memory becomes the identity, and identity shapes future expectation. So now the question sharpens. If narrative is aftermath, what structures the backstage machinery itself? Because whatever shapes that layer is quietly shaping your future. And that layer is built from repetition. Most of your life runs on automation. You wake at roughly the same time, reach for the same device, walk the same routes, react to stress in predictable patterns. Not because you consciously decided every micro-action, but because repetition carved pathways. Neurons that fire together wire together. Each loop strengthens the next loop. Cue triggers routine. Routine delivers reward. The cycle reinforces itself. Habits reduce cognitive load. They conserve energy. From a physics standpoint, they are efficient structures. From a psychological standpoint, they are destiny in slow motion. What feels like personality may be accumulated pattern. Break a habit and you feel resistance. Not moral resistance, neural resistance. You're asking circuits to reroute. Freedom, in this context, is rare. It appears in the gap where awareness interrupts automation. That gap is thin. And here's the critical twist. Habits don't form in isolation. They form in environments, which means your brain is not just shaped by internal chemistry, but by something larger pressing in from the outside. And that outside layer might be the strongest force yet. Your brain evolved in tribes, not in isolation. Belonging meant survival. Rejection meant danger. So your neural circuitry became exquisitely sensitive to status, approval, imitation, and norm alignment. Watch how opinions shift in groups. Notice how tastes converge within social circles. Observe how risk tolerance adjusts depending on who is watching. What feels like independent preference is often calibrated by invisible social feedback loops. You mirror accents. You adopt ambitions. You internalize what counts as success. Not because someone forces you, but because your nervous system reads belonging as safety. The future you imagine is often the future your network validates. This doesn't make you weak. It makes you human. But it complicates the mythology of the lone chooser standing outside influence. Your brain is embedded. Social signals shape neural firing. Neural firing shapes action. Action shapes trajectory. Zoom out far enough and you begin to see a pattern. The individual is nested inside systems of increasing scale. Biology inside psychology. Psychology inside society. And if that layering is real, then the next chapter isn't about neurons. It's about the structures surrounding them. Because the system you inhabit might be choosing long before you do. Step outside the skull for a moment. Imagine standing on a hillside shaped not by dirt and stone, but by incentives. Salaries rise in one direction. Prestige gathers in another. Risk penalties drop sharply off certain cliffs. Every society builds landscapes like this. You don't see them, but you move across them constantly. An engineer chooses stability over volatility. A student chooses a major with higher job security. A founder pivots toward where funding flows. It feels personal. It feels strategic. But zoom out and the pattern looks gravitational. Change the incentive and behavior shifts at scale. Raise the reward for one action and thousands decide simultaneously. Lower the cost of another and watch adoption surge. This isn't mind control. It's slope management. Individuals respond rationally to gradients placed before them. You can call it ambition, you can call it preference, but often it's physics in social form. The uncomfortable question is simple. How many of your biggest decisions were responses to incentive topography rather than pure self-authorship? And if incentives shape trajectories, then something even more precise shapes attention itself. Now add algorithms. Every click, pause, and scroll becomes data. Systems learn your rhythms. They predict what will keep you engaged, not by guessing wildly, but by modeling patterns across millions of users. You open an app. You think you are exploring, but the menu was arranged before you arrived. Recommendations narrow your exposure. Content aligns with prior behavior. The loop tightens. The system does not force you. It filters the field, and filtered fields influence outcomes. If you only see certain ideas, certain careers, certain lifestyles amplified, your internal map of possibility adjusts accordingly. It feels like discovery. Often it's reinforcement. This is not conspiracy. It's optimization. Engagement metrics create feedback loops that gradually sculpt preference. Your attention becomes a guided missile, and attention shapes identity. If identity shapes decision, and decision shapes future, then subtle curation can quietly bend trajectories. But algorithms are recent. The deeper pattern stretches back through history, because even before code, environment selected for certain kinds of thinkers. History loves the story of the isolated genius, the lone thinker who bends reality through sheer brilliance. But when you examine breakthroughs closely, you find clusters, similar ideas emerging in multiple places, tools becoming available at the same time, shared problems demanding solutions. Scientific revolutions tend to bloom when conditions are ready. Printing presses, telescopes, mathematical notation, funding structures, communication networks. When the soil changes, ideas sprout. The individual matters, talent matters, but timing and environment decide whose insight becomes transformative. It's less lightning from nowhere and more ignition in dry terrain. This reframes greatness. Instead of imagining creators standing outside context, we see minds embedded in enabling systems. And if even history's heroes were shaped by structural readiness, what about your personal turning points? Were they spontaneous acts of destiny? Or were they moments when your preparation intersected with opportunity gradients already forming? Because if history obeys environmental constraint, so does your biography, and biography accumulates. Small early events compound, a mentor you happen to meet, a skill you practiced longer than others, a risk you avoided out of fear. Each micro-choice branches into new constraints. This is path dependence. Once you take a route, returning to the original fork becomes costly. Doors close quietly, others open. Over time, your option set narrows in specific directions. Not necessarily worse, not necessarily better, just shaped. From the outside, your current life may look like destiny. From the inside, it felt like incremental steps. But those increments accumulate structure. Your network today is built from yesterday's decisions. Your expertise is the residue of repeated focus. Your comfort zone is engineered by familiarity. Reinvention is possible, but it requires energy precisely because you're pushing against accumulated slope. The future is not infinitely malleable. It is constrained by the path already carved, which leads to the uncomfortable mirror. When you look at your present self, how much of it is authorship, and how much is architecture? Because once you see the architecture, you can't unsee it. Layer it all together. Physics constrains matter. Biology constrains mood and energy. Neuroscience reveals preconscious preparation. Habits reduce friction. Social networks calibrate preference. Incentives channel ambition. Algorithms filter exposure. History clusters breakthroughs. Path dependence narrows branches. What remains of the sovereign chooser? This is the mirror moment, the place where the mythology of absolute authorship cracks. You are not separate from systems. You are nested within them, a node in interacting networks, a dynamic pattern moving through constraint fields. That realization can feel destabilizing. If forces shape you, does responsibility shrink? If gradients guide behavior, does meaning evaporate? Or does clarity sharpen something deeper? Because here's the twist. Recognizing constraint doesn't eliminate agency. It relocates it. Freedom may not mean standing outside the system. It may mean understanding how the system moves and adjusting accordingly. But if freedom isn't what we thought, then what is it? And if the steering wheel is smaller than we imagined, how do we use it? That's where we go next. If absolute control is an illusion, then freedom cannot mean what we were taught. It cannot mean standing outside causality, issuing commands from nowhere. It cannot mean acting without influence, without history, without biology. That version of freedom collapses under scrutiny. But there is another definition. Freedom may be the capacity to understand constraints and operate skillfully within them. A pilot does not control gravity. A surfer does not command the ocean, yet both move with intention because they understand the forces at play. When you stop imagining yourself as an uncaused cause and start seeing yourself as a pattern inside larger systems, something shifts. You stop fighting physics and begin working with it. This reframing doesn't shrink you. It clarifies you. The steering wheel may be smaller than you believed, but it is not zero. It exists within the boundaries of energy, environment, and history, and the first step toward using it is recognizing where influence actually lives, because freedom is not the absence of limits, it is competence inside them, and competence begins upstream. If systems shape behavior, then altering systems alters outcomes. This is where the narrative pivots from fatalism to leverage. You may not directly control every thought that arises, but you can influence the environment that feeds those thoughts. You can redesign friction, adjust cues, shift incentives, curate networks, move the phone out of reach, and scrolling drops. Join a community aligned with growth, and standards rise. Change sleep patterns and risk tolerance shifts. Modify inputs and outputs follow. This is not motivational rhetoric. It is structural engineering applied to life. Instead of asking, how do I force myself to change? Ask, what variables can I reposition? Your future is probabilistic, not fixed. Change the probabilitics, and you bend trajectory. The marble rolls downhill, yes, but reshape the hill, and the path changes. The uncomfortable truth becomes empowering. Agency hides in architecture. But empowerment does not erase the emotional impact of realizing how constrained we are, because before clarity stabilizes, something else happens. You feel the drop. There is a moment in this journey where the ground feels thinner. If you are not the sole author, if your decisions arise from layered forces, the heroic self-image contracts. The story of total autonomy dissolves. That can feel like loss. The ego prefers to imagine itself as prime mover, standing above influence. Letting go of that fantasy can feel like shrinking. But look closer. What dissolves is not meaning, it is illusion. Humility replaces mythology. Instead of claiming omnipotence, you gain precision. Instead of blaming yourself for every outcome, you analyze conditions. Instead of moralizing every failure, you examine structure. The drop is not the end. It is recalibration. Because once the fog clears, something steadier emerges. A recognition that you are part of a lawful unfolding, not separate from it. And that recognition doesn't erase responsibility, it refines it, which leads to the deeper layer beneath freedom, meaning. Because perhaps meaning was never about being uncaused. Perhaps it was always about participation. A wave does not choose the ocean, yet it moves. It shapes shorelines. It carries energy across distance. You are not outside the system. You are an expression of it, a configuration of matter and memory interacting with environment and time. Meaning does not require metaphysical independence. It requires engagement. When you refine your habits, you alter micro-trajectories. When you influence your network, you shift collective slope. When you build tools, you reshape future incentive landscapes. Small adjustments compound. Participation ripples. The question is no longer, did I create myself from nothing? The question becomes, given the forces at play, how skillfully can I respond? Skillfulness is not absolute freedom. It is intelligent adaptation, and adaptation is powerful. Because even inside constraints, variation exists. Even within systems, feedback loops can be redirected. Even in probabilistic worlds, likelihoods can be shifted. The steering wheel may not control the entire vehicle, but it can adjust angle within range, and that range, though bounded, is real. Which brings us to the final reversal. You do not choose the future the way you think, not as an isolated commander issuing independent commands to reality. Your choices arise from physics, biology, history, environment, and social structure interacting in real time. The future unfolds from those interactions. That is the uncomfortable reason. But here is the reversal. Understanding constraint expands agency. When you recognize that moods shift decisions, you protect sleep. When you see incentives shape ambition, you choose environments wisely. When you understand habit grooves, you design better ones. When you notice social calibration, you curate influence. The mythology of infinite freedom collapses. In its place stands disciplined awareness. Responsibility becomes sharper, not heavier. You stop pretending you can control everything. You start focusing on what moves probabilities. The steering wheel is smaller than you imagined, but it was never absent. And perhaps real maturity is this: accepting the limits of authorship while maximizing influence within them, not the fantasy of total control, but the craft of intelligent navigation. That is your future. And now you know how it actually works.